Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Joe Murphy. I'm a lawyer with Allegheny Immigration Group here in Pittsburgh. Thanks for joining my live. Our telephone number is 412-586-4131. My practice is primarily in family and humanitarian immigration. And I'm going to do something a little bit different today. My past lives, I've talked about one single topic. I'm just going to go over some interesting topics in immigration law. And if anybody has questions, of course, feel free to jump in. One topic that comes up every once in a while is the effect of minor traffic offenses on someone's ability to immigrate. Obviously, if you do serious crimes, the government can find you inadmissible as a criminal and refuse to allow you to adjust status, to become a permanent resident, or even to naturalize. But what about really truly minor infractions, something like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket? Generally, those have to be disclosed on the applications. In many places, the question asks you, have you committed any crimes or offenses in the United States? Have you been charged with any crime or offense, things of that nature? You have to disclose those, but these really minor offenses really shouldn't significantly delay or impair your application for an immigration benefit. Where you get trouble is perhaps where the infraction resulted in a short stay in jail, or complete suspension of your license, or could have resulted in a jail stay, but that was suspended or not imposed. Those sorts of things indicate something a little more dangerous and perhaps would affect your ability to get immigration benefits. But that is something that happens all the time. Now, merely being questioned or having an interaction with law enforcement in and of itself doesn't even have to be reported, as long as you're not charged with any offense or crime. And the difference between offenses or crimes is that, my practice is primarily in Pennsylvania, so when we get into that kind of stuff, I would be talking about Pennsylvania law. But there are things that law enforcement has enforcement authority over that are not really crimes. Simple things like, for example, a speeding ticket. That didn't really, you didn't steal from anybody or hurt anybody, you were just driving too fast. So that's an offense. It's a traffic offense, but it's not specifically a crime. Now, there are traffic offenses that are crimes. For example, driving under the influence of alcohol would be both. So in that case, yeah, you'd have to disclose it as a crime and as an offense. But the garden variety speeding ticket, parking ticket, you have to disclose it anyway, but I don't think that would be something that would bar you from getting any particular immigration benefit. Another thing that's been coming up a little bit is a problem of people who are adjusting status based on marriage. In many cases, traditionally the female would, adopt the last name of the male. Obviously, things are changing in that regard, but for the most part, the vast majority of marriages still operate in that way. And you have a situation where the female spouse has not completely changed her last name. That is to say, on some documents she has her maiden name, and on some documents she has her married name. In a case like that, the question becomes how do you do that when the name that, for example, you got conditional permanent residence on, perhaps your maiden name, now you've adopted, or some of the documents reflect your married name. And the way you do that is by using the other names used space on the form. Almost all immigration forms allow an alien to set forth any aliases or other names they've used during their life. And that's for a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons is to help identify a situation like that. So in the case we just recently had, the female, the spouse, had changed her name on her home country identifying documents. So her home passport said a different name than she had applied for conditional permanent residence on. So her identifying passport document didn't, so to speak, match. And what we did is we applied in the new name, the married name, and listed her maiden name, date of birth, and everything as other names used. And that allows the service to understand what's going on. It's also helpful to include a small explanation in the space in the form where that's left. Smith was my maiden name. I'm now using Jones, which is the last name of my husband, and attached here too is a copy of my marriage license showing I'm married to Mr. Jones. So that can be, that's one way of handling that, and it's usually very effective. Um, the idea of using or having used other names or aliases in many cases seems shady, and people are reluctant to use that space in the form for anything. They don't want to feel like someone who's gone by other names, but in effect, that can be used to very nicely tidy up a situation where the married spouse has her maiden name on some documents and her married name on some documents. It can help the service clarify the confusion with that explanation and the fact that the alien number has not changed. None of the other identifying metrics have changed. The fingerprints will be the same if biometrics were rerun. That really solves that problem, and it's a nice way to do it. It can be inexpensive and easy. Another one that is of interest is something part of the immigration through marriage suite of interesting things is a marriage fraud interview, sometimes called a Stokes interview. Most people have what's called a normal adjustment of status interview. That's triggered by filing the I-130. This person's going to adjust status based on marriage. Those interviews maybe take 30 or 45 minutes, and in the vast majority of cases, that's the only interview that's ever had. It's a quick look by the immigration authorities. They've already seen the bona fides that you filed with the I-130, and they want to see even if both spouses show up. Where the service suspects fraud, marriage fraud, and again, they're always looking for that, they can do what's called a Stokes interview. Now, Stokes is a immigration law case from, I think, the mid-'70s, where Stokes and another fellow had been put through the procedure that was being used then, and it was a real sneak attack. They were denied counsel. They weren't told that what their rights were. Really, a bunch of procedural rights were denied. And I think one of the guys, not Stokes, just withdrew his application for his spouse, but Stokes went through and filed a whole bunch of stuff. And ultimately, the decision was made that you can't do these more aggressive, so to speak, marriage fraud interviews without people being given notice that that's what's going on, without them being advised of their rights, and without them being afforded the meaningful opportunity to have their counsel involved. There's people have lawyers and immigration lawyers that can help them. I mean, we can't answer questions for you, but we can advise you in an interview of that nature. But where the resolution of the case, again, was those things. That has to be, as a practical matter, almost any notice to come in for any interview now does appraise you of all of your rights, of your right to have an attorney, and so on and so forth. So the way things work now, almost any interview, even your first marriage interview, could be turned into a Stokes interview based on whether or not fraud is suspected. Now, why would they suspect fraud? Well, in many cases, again, a fraudulent marriage is one of the other spouse won't show up. And in some cases, there's a lack of commingling. If these people are engaged in marriage fraud, sometimes there's a little bit of money changing hands, and the people getting that money don't want to squander it on building a fake marriage. They just want to get their money, and that would interfere with their profit. Other things that can trigger a Stokes interview, and interestingly, or things you might not expect, people who were in a perfectly legitimate interview, and I saw this actually personally about 10 years ago. The husband, who was the alien spouse, was down and out with a bunch of guys from his similar immigration background, and he started joking with his friends about the fact he was claiming that it was so funny he was doing a fake marriage. He wasn't. He just was talking, as people do, sometimes bragging about how smart or slick or how capable they are of getting over on this and that. But one of his friends, so to speak, overheard him saying that and went to CIS and told him that so-and-so's out claiming his marriage is a fraud. Now, the ultimate resolution of this was a very, very hot encounter for that particular foreigner who was joking about his marriage being a fraud. The flip side of it is his quote-unquote buddy was able to get a snitch visa, an S visa, and stay in the country, and that person probably would have had to go home because they were only here on a tourist visa. So clowning around like that opens the door for someone who might have a motivation to go to the service and tell them that you're in a fraudulent marriage, and then again that would trigger that Stokes interview. A Stokes interview can be long. There's a lot of questions. They can be quite intrusive. When was the last time you were intimate, physically intimate with your spouse is a common question. Who made dinner? What did you have for breakfast? This sort of stuff. So, and it can go on. And the spouses are separated at Stokes interview. Both interviews are recorded and they're compared for discrepancies. So it's just another one of the mechanisms. But if you get yourself tripped up in a Stokes interview, obviously you want to go through it where you have advance notice, and you might, a second interview, a callback. You definitely want to have counsel at something like that, because I mean that's what Stokes is about. If you ever do have a problem, or you think you might trip something, or like in the example I gave, someone is informing on your marriage is fake when it's real, just to get an S visa. You call me again. My name is Joe Murphy. I'm with Allegheny Immigration Group in Pittsburgh. Our telephone number is 412-586-4131. And my practice is focused on family and humanitarian. I don't do very much employment-related immigration. That's almost I hate to say anything's a specialty, but it seems to be a very specialized field of knowledge within the specialized field of knowledge of immigration law. Let's see, is there anything interesting I can tell you? Well, another one that's of a lot of interest lately is what are called U-Visa. Part of a humanitarian practice involves representing victims of crime, people who are lawfully in the United States and fall victim of certain qualifying crimes can get a visa to stay here. Even that would replace the whatever lawful status they already had. And I'll give you the example of someone who visits as a tourist and is victimized by a crime, perhaps in Times Square or something of that nature. I've often said that almost every visa has one thing in common, and that is someone or something here in the United States wants the alien who's getting that visa here. So, for example, a tourist visa, the tourism industry wants you here. A K visa, which is a fiancé visa, your intending spouse in the United States want you here. Employment visa, there's the business wants you here. There are special visas for performing artists and stuff. Those are all, but there's always someone or something wants you here. When you talk about a U visa, the someone or something that wants you here is the prosecutorial apparatus that wants to catch and punish the criminal. So again, you have to have a crime that qualifies. If you're a victim of, someone stole your library book, that probably isn't going to count for a U visa. So you have to, one of the common ways that immigration lawyers talk about is you have to be both harmed and helpful. So harmed, again, the qualifying offenses, they're really outrageous offenses, and there's a couple of them I have listed here. Abduction, blackmail, extortion, rape, kidnapping, torture, stalking's on there, which is kind of interesting. So that would be the harmed, right? You'd be identified as the victim in a police report that indicated that this crime had happened to you. And then you have to be helpful. And helpful means you're going to cooperate with the authorities in their efforts to catch and prosecute the person who did this. It doesn't mean that you have to be successful, but it means you have to cooperate. So if you've been mugged, you have to allow the authority, you have to give a report, you have to allow the authorities to film any injuries, perhaps participate in a lineup, those sorts of things. If you've been helped, or if you've been harmed and helpful, and again, harm in one of those enumerated ways, and helpful in the sense that, not that the person gets caught, I mean that would be helpful, but just that you cooperate with the investigation, you can ask the district attorney's office or the U.S. attorney's office, whoever's prosecuting the crime, to sign off on a U visa that they need you here for a case. And they can even do that when the case is over, so long as you've been harmed and helpful. So that's the U visa. One of the neat things about a U visa is if you stay in U visa status for 3 years and don't do anything while you're in that status that makes you inadmissible to the United States. Like if you were to do crimes yourself, you can apply for citizenship after 3 years off a U visa. Now you need the government to exercise what's called discretion. You have to show that you've kind of dug in here enough that it would be cruel and unnecessary and so on to send you home. But many people who become victims of crime can become citizens based on that U visa process. We talked about name changes. That is where perhaps an alien spouse is changing their name to assume the last name of the citizen spouse, and not all the documents have the same name. I saw a case recently where the female spouse had adopted the last name of her American citizen husband, but only on some of her documents. In fact, her passport showed a different last name than her conditional permanent resident card, and she sought to remove the conditions on her permanent residence, and her identifying documents had a different last name. My suggestion in a case like that was to use one. Have you ever used? There's a box on every form. Other names and aliases you've used. So we had the alien fill out the application in the name of the most recent passport, which had her husband's last name, and then list her maiden name as another name she's used. Now, almost all immigration forms have extra space toward the back to submit a more detailed explanation of one answer or another. So you would check that and say you were submitting a more detailed explanation, and you put in there. We listed I'm applying as my married name, the other name I use is my maiden name, and I'm attaching a copy of my marriage certificate, and that is a nice tidy way to clear up last name variation in documents. It's not a horribly serious matter because the alien with the different last names will also have the same birth date, first name, middle name, alien number, even ultimately fingerprints if biometrics were elicited as both names. They would understand, and that would make it easier for the service to track those applications together. I spent a little bit of time talking about Stokes interviews. Those are always a subject of stress. That's the marriage fraud interview where they haul a couple in, separate them, ask them a series of questions. Sometimes those interviews can go on for hours, and as I said, they can be really invasive or a little bit even embarrassing questions. One of the common questions that has been historically asked in a Stokes interview is what's your spouse's cell phone number? Now with modern cell phones, believe it or not, it's funny because back in the day one would expect that each spouse would know the other's phone number, and now because of the memory of these phones, the fact that someone does know it is a little bit suspicious sometimes too. In one recent interview, the examiner asked the female spouse, what's his phone number, and the female spouse happened to know it off the top of her head. And the examiner said that's unusual. Most people don't with the modern phones. And the alien said, well, yeah, but he keeps the supermarket shopping card that we get points on, and I have to use the phone number to identify myself. And the examiner said, oh, okay, you're definitely married if you're trying to save money at the supermarket. And I think the last thing I talked about was U visas, and those are visas for victims of crime here in the United States, which can ultimately end up in a citizenship or a green card and citizenship. And again, the rules for U visas that you have to be a victim of crime, that is to be harmed by certain crimes. I gave some examples. They're all terrible crimes: extortion, blackmail, being held hostage, subjected to incest or torture. So harmed, and then the other component is helpful, and that is cooperating with law enforcement and any requests they give for your story, to photograph you if you're injured, the nature of your injuries. Again, participate in lineup trials if necessary. But if you are harmed and helpful, in many cases, the law enforcement agency seeking to prosecute the perpetrator of your victimhood will sign off to keep you here because they need you as a witness. And that would get you a U status. After 3 years in U status, you could apply for citizenship, I believe, or permanent residence. But that's about what I have for today. We didn't have a lot of viewers. Maybe it was a bad time of the day. But this will be, I'll probably edit this, put in some captions, makes it easier for people to, a lot of people watch this on their phones and they have the volume on. But this will be back up probably tomorrow afternoon. Again, my name is Joe Murphy. I'm a lawyer with Allegheny Immigration Group here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I practice primarily family and humanitarian immigration. My phone number is 412-586-4131, and do give me a call. You could shoot me a text on here or a private message if it's something private, and I'll be happy to answer your immigration questions. If you like this and you're watching it and you think it's valuable, I'd ask that you share our content, like it, usual stuff. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.